Hey y'all, my name's Tyson. This time around, we're going to have a look at the intersect with model command. Intersect with model is one of these tools that's been around with SketchUp for actually quite a while. And some of the things that you might use it for have been replaced with the solid tools or some of the solid tool extensions out there. But there are cases where this tool will still intersect geometry in a way that the solid tools wouldn't work. And there can be use cases for it otherwise. Another interesting thing about it is that you should be able to use intersect with model in any version of SketchUp, web, iPad, desktop, whereas the solid tools aren't always available in every version. So pretty interesting stuff, and there's some nuances to it that I think are also kind of interesting. We're going to have a look at all of that. So let's jump in. All right. Um, if I extend these shapes, something like this, intersect with model is going to create edges. So, right, for example, these things don't work, and it would take a lot of work to actually trace out all of these edges, which is what we'd want to do if we wanted to cut these shapes out. So if I undo that, instead, I'm going to select all this geometry, right click on it and say intersect faces, model. And it cuts out every place where surfaces intersect. And in fact, if we look at the X-ray mode, it's done that even internally with these arches. So let me undo that intersect, and you can see we're missing all those edges. And then once again, I'll redo that with X-ray on just to show creating all of those intersecting edges. Now, whereas solid tools, you would have some of these, blocks removed entirely. Intersect with model is just going to create edges. It still leaves it to you to decide what you want to keep and what you want to remove. So with that in mind, I would probably come in here and say, okay, well, I'm going to select this geometry, this geometry, this geometry, and that, delete those, and then I will move to the side, select these, delete those, and you can see I accidentally deleted too much, so I'm going to undo, try that again, and then finally delete from this side. Again, I did too much, undo, and I could turn X-ray mode on perhaps to help, but that is what I was trying to achieve. Now that would be very difficult to create. Um, again, solid tools would do it, but it would be difficult to create in another way. A couple things to keep in mind when using intersect with model. One is this front back faces, right? The difference between the white and the blue faces. You do want to keep, if we look at the monochrome mode, there's no change here because we've got sort of, again, this notion of front and back faces. I'm going to right click on one of the front faces and say orient faces. You will typically have results that have kind of those back faces displayed when using intersect with models. So you may want to orient the faces um, and align them all in the same way. One other thing to keep in mind when using intersect with model, and I'm going to undo back to our example here. I pulled these faces pretty far beyond, and I did that intentionally because I knew I wanted to delete them. When you have geometry intersecting, you may want to extend your geometry way out, something like this, and then when you intersect it, intersect faces with model, That just makes it so much easier to draw easy, big selection windows and delete geometry you don't need. So keep that in mind. You may want to extend your intersecting geometry, especially the stuff that you plan to get rid of. And like I say, if we were to turn on hidden geometry, I'm sorry, not hidden geometry, X-ray mode, that may make it easier to select and delete some of the geometry we don't want from here. Come in, right click and say orient faces so that they're all the same. That's the basics. Uh, intersect geometry with model. Let's have a look at some of the more nuanced cases. All right, so here we have a couple shapes. And like we just saw, if I move one of these into another, I could right click on either of these shapes and say intersect faces with model or selection. So for example, if I move this surface over here and I have that surface and say just the cone selected, I could say intersect faces with model, which would be everything, or with just the selection. And you can see it does not intersect with this sphere. It only intersected with the cone and the block. We're going to undo that. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you want the geometry left over, so if I intersect these two, I delete that and delete that, and I've got the leftover geometry from that sphere. So you want to keep, these are in the same context. What we're going to look at next is that if you do it with groups, you can get some different results than, for example, this. Again, I might come in and say front faces, so I have all front faces. That's intersecting model with selection or with the entire model. And over here, I'm going to select these. I'm going to group them really quick. Selecting them, I'm grouping them. This time, if I move these together and say intersect model, and it's saying intersect faces with model, what's going to happen is that because this group and this group are separate, and we were just intersecting from the outside, it does create intersecting edges, but they're not part of either group. So if you want to create just the edges or separate them for some reason, you can, if those are groups. Now, of course, if I want to come in, I could come into one of these, intersect faces with model, and now those edges are part of that group, but the sphere, if we come in and delete this, that was in a different context. The sphere was in a different group. So it did not leave that as part of the geometry. So you have control over what gets left based on the context that you are using. Keep that in mind. One more thing about context. So let's undo that one more time. And I'm going to make this cone a component. And I will create a few copies. Now again, you may think that because this is a component, if we intersected these, that it might affect that. But again, that's on the outside, those edges. So what we actually need to do is go into the component and intersect the faces. So if I move this over here, and let's say I select the sphere, I'm going to cut it out, go into my component, paste it, but I'm going to move it sort of over here. And you can see that by doing so on these other components, the geometry overlaps these components. So if I came into and I said, okay, I'm inside this component. I'm going to right click and say intersect faces with model. What we'll see is that even though this sphere was not part of it, because it was overlapping, we intersected the faces with the entire model. And so it created those edges too. So I'm going to undo that. And that's what this final option is. If I right click instead and say intersect model with context, context is the groups and components. Are you in the large model context? Are you inside a group or component? So this will eliminate anything that's not part of this component. So context, now I can delete that sphere, but you can see it did not interact with that sphere that was outside. So you have a lot of control again because we can right click and say intersect faces with model, which is anything that might come in contact with context, so just within the group or component, or with selection. So even within the context, I might say, I only want, this object, and not some other object. So I might say intersect faces with selection. So you have a lot of options in how you intersect objects. So let's look at another thing to keep in mind. That's how you use intersect with model. The rest of this is just some tips and tricks for using it effectively. Let's say we're creating this small part. And this is a tip that's useful for follow me and some other things. We've shared it a lot. But when you're dealing with small parts, and I want to say intersect these together and these together, but if I look at the hidden geometry, I might be creating some really tiny little edges in here. And tiny, tiny edges don't tend to work that well. SketchUp is a kind of architectural scale modeler. So instead, when I'm working on something very small, I will usually take that and either scale it up by a factor of, let's say, 100. That way I can shrink it back down by a known factor, or I will just make it a component. Then make a copy of the component and scale that up. And then, if I don't have to know exact dimensions, it doesn't matter how big I scale it up. Anything I do here is going to happen down here. So here, I might come in and I will ungroup those, intersect with model, delete these surfaces out, select and delete these surfaces, and erase these edges. And so forth. And we could continue working on this. A couple things to keep in mind here. Like we said, we're doing this on this large scale because that just creates good results on our real small version. You may sometimes, I copied this object off to the side, the one we just used, and instead I'm going to scale it up. Sometimes, and this is one of those things you can't do with, let's say, the solid tools, sometimes, I'm going to flip this, you may just want to create some intersecting edges to paint something differently. So if I go into this geometry, I'm going to group it again and say, select these faces and say intersect faces with model. This is outside, so it did all the intersecting edges, and now I can select this, move it off to the side, and I've created something where maybe I'm just trying to paint this a different color. And another aspect of that that can be useful is this piece. So instead, let me just again as an arbitrary example, move this over here. These are two different groups, but if I created them carefully, I might be able to do something like intersect those faces and then create a series of edges that might be difficult to create in another way, because now I can take that and use something like follow me and create a follow me path or some other way. So just a lot of flexibility, a lot of options that are available with um, intersect with model. I want to show one final example. So I'm going to erase this one. Again, all of the changes we made happen on our small version, our real size version. But the scaling things up is a technique we use a lot and very useful. Let's say that, and this isn't the best example, but just one more example. Let's say we've got this, we want to create this column. Okay. So I've got our basic column, and then we want to create the fluting for it. I think that's what it's called. It may be the case that I just ungroup everything here, right click, intersect faces with model. Depending on the complexity of your geometry, it may take a few moments, but it does a pretty good job. And here we go. I can start to come in and clean up the geometry, and then I may reverse these faces. So I need to keep doing that around to the other ones as well. Sometimes I'm going to undo that back to here where these were all separate. You may create geometry that takes some effort to clean up, so you may want that separate. So it is possible. I'm going to take this and make a copy. I'll make a copy at, let's say, 20 feet. I'm going to make 2 copies. This time, I'm going to come in just to the column. I'm going to right click and say intersect faces with model. And then I will select this all, deselect the column, delete all of the fluting. Now, based on your geometry, it may be simpler that you're doing something like this, where you are breaking out the pieces that you want to intersect together. It may or may not. Again, this may not be the best example, but I just want to show it as an option. So there was the results of intersecting that geometry. And here, we're going to do the opposite. So I'm going to select, deselect the column, group all of these together, and then I'm going to come in and select these and ungroup them. So now I can, again, right click and say intersect faces with model. So they're going to intersect with the column. Again, it could take a few moments, but should happen fairly quickly. And then I can be left over with that geometry. Now, this is kind of an odd case. Again, not necessarily that you would do it this way, but if I move that back exactly the 20 feet, go into that group, and I'm going to reverse those faces. If for some reason you wanted these separate, we still have them separate. Or at this point, I could select them both, ungroup them to merge that geometry together because it overlaps perfectly. Again, that may or may not be something that you find that useful, but it's possible because Intersect with Model just gives you a lot of options on the geometry, how it gets intersected, what geometry is left over. So, how was that for a whirlwind of things thrown at you? I because I'm kind of old school. I really like using Intersect with Model. I do find it still is useful, even though I am a fan of the solid tools. And the solid tools would be the case you might use for some of these examples. It's still useful to know. It's useful to know that you can intersect with the whole model, or just within the context of a group or component, or just with pieces that you select. It's just nice to have some of those options. So hopefully you found that helpful and you have some interesting uses for intersect with model command. As always, please do like, subscribe for more, and let us know what else you would like to see or if you have any questions on this particular technique. Uh, Thanks, y'all. We'll see you next time.